In the remote wilderness of Maine, nestled between towering pines and jagged cliffs, there exists a forgotten story, one so chilling that even the bravest souls dare not speak its name. It is the tale of the Ashford family, whose dark legacy has been buried for centuries beneath layers of silence and denial. For over 30 years, they operated a sanctuary, a convent, or so they claimed. It was meant to offer solace and healing, a place where troubled souls could find peace. But beneath the tranquil facade of their stone walls, a far more sinister reality festered. 600 women entered the Convent of Eternal Tears, seeking salvation. Few returned, and those who did were never the same. Their eyes, once full of life, became hollow, their memories fractured, their personalities forever altered. The authorities, upon investigating, found records so disturbing that they refused to release them for over a century. What could be so horrifying that it was kept hidden, not for years, but for generations? Tonight, we venture where others have feared to tread, to uncover the truth that the Ashford family went to great lengths to conceal. But be warned, this is no ordinary story. This is not a tale of misguided faith or supernatural forces. It is a story of calculated cruelty, of people willing to do whatever it takes to gain knowledge, no matter the cost. It is the story of 3 women whose thirst for power and control led them to experiment on those they swore to protect. Before we plunge deeper into the twisted history of the Ashford family, let me ask you this. Do you have the courage to continue? Are you brave enough to uncover the darkest chapters of American history? If so, hit that subscribe button and join us as we delve into a past shrouded in darkness, a history buried in fear. In the late 18th century, when the wilderness of Maine was still part of Massachusetts, there was no shortage of hardship. Isolated communities struggled against bitter winters, where survival was more about endurance than comfort. The coastal town of Millbridge, with a population barely exceeding 300, was a trading post for lumber merchants and fishermen who braved the deadly waters of the Atlantic. But far from the prying eyes of the town, hidden deep within the dense forests, was the Ashford family's land, an expanse of untouched wilderness that would become notorious for horrors no one could have imagined. The Ashford women arrived in Millbridge on a gray October morning, their wagon heavy with crates and medical supplies that seemed to draw more attention than a simple religious order would require. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford, the leader of the trio, stepped down from the wagon with the air of someone used to command. She was a woman in her early 40s, with striking silver-streaked hair and gray eyes that seemed to see through the very soul of anyone she gazed upon. They said they were Anglican nuns fleeing persecution. But were they truly? Or was something darker at play? From the moment they arrived, there were whispers of strange rituals and even stranger treatments. But it wasn't until later that the true nature of their work would begin to surface. The story begins in the late 18th century, a time when the wild, untamed land of Maine was still part of Massachusetts. It was a place where survival came at a high cost, and the struggle for food, shelter, and warmth was unrelenting. The inhabitants of Millbridge, a coastal town with no more than 300 souls, knew well the perils of the harsh winters and unpredictable seas. The small settlement served as a trading post for the fishermen who ventured into the treacherous waters of the Atlantic and the lumber merchants who braved the forests, cutting down the mighty pines to fuel the growing needs of New England's expanding cities. But Millbridge, with its sleepy atmosphere and close-knit community, was not the kind of place one would expect to find a story so dark, so twisted, that it would be forgotten for generations. The town's simple charm, surrounded by dense forests and rocky shores, hid a secret so deep that even the most seasoned veterans of the American frontier would never believe it. The Ashford sisters, with their strange mission and quiet authority, would come to know this land as their own, and it would be here that their chilling legacy would unfold. The arrival of the Ashford women was heralded by whispers that stretched from the town center to the edges of Millbridge. A gray October morning saw their wagon, loaded with mysterious crates and medical supplies, rolling into the town. The people of Millbridge, familiar with the hardships of frontier life, had become accustomed to seeing all kinds of travelers. However, the Ashford sisters did not look like ordinary visitors. Their solemn appearance, their commanding presence, and the aura of mystery that surrounded them were impossible to ignore. The women were led by Mother Superior Agatha Ashford, a woman whose appearance alone seemed to command attention. In her early 40s, she was tall and composed, her silver-streaked hair flowing neatly under a modest bonnet. Her gray eyes, piercing and unblinking, seemed to take in everything around her, cataloging details with an unnerving precision. She spoke with the refined accent of someone from the educated classes of Europe, a voice that carried authority without a hint of warmth. To the residents of Millbridge, she seemed like someone accustomed to power, accustomed to being obeyed. Next to Agatha was Sister Prudence Ashford, a woman of strikingly pale skin and a tall, thin figure. Unlike her superior, Prudence did not speak much. Instead, she observed the world with a detached coldness, her pale blue eyes hiding any trace of emotion. When she did speak, her voice had the cultured tones of a Scotswoman, but beneath that, there was a hardness, a chilling quality that made the locals uncomfortable. She was a woman of few words, and yet her silence was enough to send a shiver down the spine of anyone who crossed her path. Then there was Temperance Ashford, the youngest of the three. Barely in her early 20s, she possessed a haunting beauty that drew attention wherever she went. Her dark eyes, set deep within her pale face, held an unsettling depth, an emptiness that left those who met her gaze feeling as though they were being scrutinized rather than merely looked at. Her raven-black hair framed her porcelain skin, and though her beauty seemed innocent at first, there was something distinctly off about the way she carried herself. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes, and her gaze lingered just a little too long on the people she passed. It was a beauty that made mothers instinctively pull their children closer. The Ashford sisters claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in England, seeking refuge in the remote wilderness of Maine. They presented themselves as women of faith, intent on establishing a new order in the New World, a place where they could continue their work in peace. Their letters of recommendation from English church officials were impressive, but they were later revealed to be nothing more than carefully forged documents, designed to lend them credibility. Their story, though, was convincing enough for the Protestant community of Millbridge, who welcomed the presence of educated women in their midst, seeing them as a civilizing influence on the frontier settlement. The Ashford sisters were not without means. They carried gold coins in abundance, enough to purchase nearly 200 acres of remote forest land from a widow who had struggled to pay off her late husband's debts. The price they paid, 3 times the land's assessed value, raised a few eyebrows, but it also ensured their swift acceptance by the locals. The widow, grateful for the generous offer, encouraged the town's officials to lend their support to the sisters, and so they did. Soon, workers from Millbridge and the surrounding towns were hired to construct the Ashford sisters' religious retreat. As the building began to rise from the wilderness, the workers couldn't help but notice its strange architecture. The structure was far larger than any typical convent or church. It was built of gray stone quarried from the nearby coast, and its walls were thick enough to muffle any sound from within. The windows were unusually small, positioned high on the walls, making it impossible to see inside. And then there was the basement, an extensive level that required significant excavation and reinforced foundations. When questioned about the peculiar design, Mother Superior Agatha offered a calm explanation, one that would satisfy the curious workers for the time being. She explained that penitence required solitude, and solitude required proper containment. She claimed that their sisters in England had learned that spiritual healing was most effective when the penitent was completely removed from worldly distractions. Her explanation, though logical on the surface, did little to ease the growing sense of unease that began to settle over the town. As the months went by, the sisters oversaw every detail of the construction with a precision that bordered on obsession. They insisted on reinforced doors, heavy locks, drainage systems that could handle large volumes of liquid, and ventilation shafts that seemed better suited for a medical facility than a religious retreat. When questioned, they offered no clear answers, only vague references to their experience with similar institutions in Europe. The workers, uncomfortable but eager to earn their pay, continued their work in silence. Yet, despite the serene facade they projected, There was something undeniably unsettling about the Ashford sisters. Their quiet authority, their cryptic speech, and their insistence on keeping their operations shrouded in secrecy raised suspicions among the locals. But none of them could have imagined the horrors that would eventually unfold behind the convent's stone walls. It was on that fateful October morning, the same morning the Ashford sisters arrived in Millbridge, that the town's tranquil life would begin to unravel. The sky above was a dull gray, casting a muted light across the land as the heavy wagon rolled into town. Its arrival was unceremonious, but it marked the beginning of something far more sinister. The townspeople, accustomed to the occasional traveler, noticed nothing at first. After all, a wagon filled with crates and medical supplies wasn't out of the ordinary. But it wasn't the contents of the wagon that would capture their attention. It was the women who emerged from it. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford was the first to step down, and her presence was immediately commanding. As she placed one foot on the dirt road, she surveyed the town with an air of quiet authority. She stood tall, her silver-streaked hair shining beneath her bonnet, her sharp gray eyes scanning everything before her, as though cataloging each detail for a purpose known only to her. There was something in her posture, her calm, composed bearing, that made her appear both regal and untouchable. Agatha's voice, when she spoke, was soft yet firm, like the whisper of wind through autumn leaves, carrying an undertone of power that left no room for contradiction. The accent that rolled from her lips was unmistakably European, cultured and precise. To those who met her, it was clear she wasn't just any religious woman seeking refuge from persecution. No, she was something more, someone who had been accustomed to being listened to being obeyed. And there, on that gray morning, as she stood on the edge of the town, the first seeds of doubt were planted in the minds of the locals. Behind her, Sister Prudence Ashford stepped down, her movements deliberate and measured. Unlike Agatha, Prudence did not make eye contact with the townspeople. Instead, she observed them from beneath her lowered gaze, her tall, gaunt figure casting a long shadow. Her pale blue eyes, however, caught the attention of anyone who dared to look. They were cold and emotionless, as if they could see straight through to the soul. She said little, speaking only when necessary, and when she did, her Scottish accent seemed to send a chill through the air. Her very presence carried an unsettling aura, one that the townspeople would not soon forget. The third to emerge from the wagon was the youngest of the three, Temperance Ashford. She was barely 22, a striking figure with raven-black hair, porcelain skin, and eyes that held a quiet intensity. There was an unsettling beauty about her, an unnerving quality that made the town's mothers instinctively pull their children closer as she passed. Her smile, though perfectly formed, never reached her eyes. It was as though she was watching the world around her, studying people as if they were specimens to be observed. There was a coldness in her gaze, a remoteness that made those who met it feel uncomfortable, as though something was missing. And in her beauty, there was a distinct sense of danger that no one could quite place. The sisters' arrival was not entirely without intrigue. Some of the townsfolk speculated that they had come to bring order to the growing settlement of Millbridge. There had long been a sense of lawlessness in the region, a lack of structure, and some believed that the presence of educated, religious women would help restore a sense of decency to the rough frontier town. The Ashford sisters claimed to be Anglican nuns, exiled from England due to religious persecution. Their story was one of hardship and struggle, the tale of women who had fled their homeland in search of a place to practice their faith freely. They presented letters of recommendation from Anglican church officials, letters that were later found to be masterful forgeries. At the time, however, the townspeople were satisfied with their story. They welcomed the sisters with open arms, seeing in them a chance for something more refined, something beyond the harsh realities of frontier life. The women spoke of building a new religious order, a place where they could help the troubled souls of women who had strayed from the righteous path. In a world where women were often seen as weaker, where their voices were silenced, the idea of a refuge built by women, for women, was compelling. The Ashford sisters, with their calm demeanor and serene speech, quickly won the trust of the townspeople. They paid for nearly 200 acres of remote land from a widow who had struggled with debt. The land was overvalued, but it was a price the Ashford sisters seemed more than willing to pay. The widow, grateful for the generous offer, was eager to make the sale, and the local officials were only too happy to support the deal. The Ashford sisters had money, resources, and a compelling story, and soon they had the backing of the town. Construction on the convent began almost immediately. The workers who arrived to build the structure were struck by the peculiar nature of the plans. The convent was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was built of thick gray stone, quarried from the nearby coast, and its walls were so massive that no sound could be heard from within. The windows were small, positioned high on the walls, ensuring that no one could see into the building. The workers were instructed to dig deep into the earth, creating a basement that was far larger and more reinforced than any structure of this kind would require. When questioned about the unusual design, Agatha was always calm and collected in her explanations. She spoke of the need for penitence and solitude, that the truly faithful required isolation to cleanse their souls. She even claimed that their experience in religious institutions across Europe had taught them the necessity of such measures. Her answers were measured, reasonable even, and they put the workers' concerns to rest, at least for a time. But despite the calm explanations, a growing unease began to spread through Millbridge. The Ashford sisters' methods, their quiet control over everything and everyone, began to raise questions. It was as though the women were hiding something behind their serene exteriors. What was it they were truly doing behind the high stone walls? And more importantly, why did it seem that those who entered the convent never came out the same, if they came out at all? From the moment the Ashford sisters arrived in Millbridge, their purpose seemed shrouded in layers of secrecy. The townspeople, initially taken by their serene manner and calm demeanor, believed that they had come to help. The sisters spoke often of their divine mission to bring order and discipline to women who had gone astray. They painted pictures of a religious haven where troubled souls could find redemption. In a time and place where women's lives were often dictated by the expectations of others, the idea of a sanctuary run by women, for women, seemed like a blessing. They claimed that the convent would provide spiritual healing for women suffering from various ailments. The Ashford sisters described their methods as a mix of spiritual discipline and medical expertise, though they were vague on the specifics. They spoke of addressing the root causes of female hysteria and melancholia, terms that were common in medical discourse of the time, yet their approach was unlike anything the town had ever heard. It wasn't long before word began to spread beyond Millbridge about the Ashford sisters' seemingly miraculous treatments. Women from the surrounding areas, from Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston, began to send their daughters, wives, and sisters to the Convent of Eternal Tears. At first, the women who arrived at the convent were those who had fallen into some kind of scandal or public disgrace. Unmarried mothers, wives who had publicly challenged their husbands, daughters who rejected the notion of arranged marriages. These were the kinds of women who found themselves sent to the convent for treatment. The cost was steep: $20 for a month, $50 for 3 months, and a staggering $100 for what the sisters called complete reformation. For families torn apart by a rebellious daughter or a wife whose actions had threatened their social standing, this was a small price to pay to restore order and respectability. The Ashford sisters' reputation for transforming troublesome women spread like wildfire. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones of the sisters' ability to completely change a woman's behavior, making them more docile, more obedient, more in line with the expectations of society. What the sisters didn't mention, however, was the true nature of their methods. While they spoke of spiritual healing and reformation, they were, in fact, engaging in far darker practices that would soon come to light as the town's growing suspicion turned to fear. In reality, the Ashford sisters had far grander ambitions than merely reforming women's behavior. They weren't interested in saving souls, at least not in the way they claimed. Their goal was not simply to mend the moral fabric of their patients, but to bend and twist their very minds to suit their own vision of obedience and control. The spiritual and medical treatments they offered were nothing more than a facade, a mask behind which they carried out a far more sinister agenda. The first sign that something was amiss came when one of the patients, a young woman named Elizabeth Thornton, returned home after 3 months of treatment at the convent. Elizabeth had been sent to the Ashford sisters after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce, a scandal that threatened the reputation of her family. When she returned, her demeanor had changed drastically. Gone was the fiery, independent woman who had challenged her husband's authority. In her place was a quiet, docile woman who spoke only when addressed and seemed incapable of expressing her own thoughts or desires. When shown a letter she had written before her treatment, Elizabeth stared at it as if it were written by a complete stranger. Her once strong-willed personality had been wiped clean, replaced with a meek, unassertive woman who simply accepted whatever came her way. The Ashford sisters claimed that Elizabeth's transformation was proof of their success. To them, it was a triumph of their methods, a woman who had been reformed, who no longer challenged her husband's authority. But to Elizabeth's family, it was a nightmare. Her parents were horrified by the changes they saw in her, but they couldn't bring themselves to question the respected nuns who had cured their daughter. Elizabeth's case wasn't unique, though. More and more women returned from the convent, transformed in ways that left their families in shock and disbelief. Some, like Elizabeth, seemed to have lost all memory of their previous selves. Others, though seemingly compliant, carried a deep sadness in their eyes, as though they had been robbed of something precious but couldn't remember what it was. As word of these miraculous transformations spread, the Ashford sisters' influence continued to grow. They became seen as experts in women's health, their reputation reaching far beyond the small town of Millbridge. Even Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a respected physician from the nearby town of Portland, took an interest in their work. Dr. Hartwell had long been fascinated by the field of mental health, particularly the treatment of women's psychological conditions. When he visited the convent and saw firsthand the methods employed by the Ashford sisters, he was impressed by their apparent understanding of female hysteria and mental illness. He praised their work, noting in his journal that the sisters were decades ahead of American medical practices in their approach to treating mental disorders. What Dr. Hartwell didn't know, however, was that the sisters' methods were far more sinister than anything he could have imagined. They weren't simply treating psychological ailments, they were experimenting on their patients, using them as subjects in an ongoing series of cruel and inhumane tests. Under the guise of spiritual purification and medical treatment, the Ashford sisters were altering the very minds of the women who came to them, manipulating their personalities, erasing their memories, and turning them into obedient, compliant beings who would serve their every whim. The sisters' goal was not merely to heal, it was to control. They believed that by gaining complete control over a woman's mind, they could create the perfect society of docile, obedient women, each one serving the needs of the men around them without question or resistance. The surgeries, the drugs, the psychological conditioning, they were all part of a twisted experiment to see just how much control they could wield over another human being. But despite the Ashford sisters' cold efficiency, there were cracks in their operation. The patients who emerged from their convent were no longer the same. They had been stripped of their former selves, their identities erased and replaced with a new, more malleable version. And while the townspeople believed the Ashford sisters' methods were miraculous, there were those who began to wonder if something far darker was happening behind the convent's stone walls. What was really happening to the women who entered the convent? And why was it that so many never returned, or returned only to be forever changed? As the Ashford sisters continued to grow their influence in Millbridge and beyond, whispers of their strange practices began to stir. What had started as admiration for their seemingly successful methods soon turned into murmurs of doubt. Families that had sent their daughters, wives, and mothers to the convent began to notice disturbing changes in the women who returned. Gone were the rebellious spirits, the lively minds, and the once vibrant personalities. In their place was a quiet, almost robotic compliance, a blank slate that made the town's most respected citizens uneasy. The first person to voice his concerns was Dr. Samuel Hartwell. Initially, he had praised the Ashford sisters for their groundbreaking work, but as he continued to observe their methods from a medical perspective, he began to question their true intentions. He had visited the convent multiple times, but what he saw during these visits troubled him. Though he remained loyal to his role as a physician, the more he observed, the more uneasy he became. One afternoon, during a particularly tense visit to the convent, Dr. Hartwell had a conversation with Sister Prudence Ashford, the cold and calculating member of the Ashford family. She explained the progress they had made in their treatments, and although she spoke with a clinical detachment, there was something in her eyes that made Dr. Hartwell uneasy. When he asked for more specific details about the procedures being used, Prudence merely offered vague, unconvincing answers. Yet, it was in this moment that Dr. Hartwell noticed something even more unsettling: an absence of patience. There were fewer and fewer women in the convent. It was as if they had disappeared, but no one spoke about them. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Hartwell confided his concerns to his closest colleagues, but his warnings were met with skepticism. After all, the Ashford sisters had a reputation for miraculous transformations. It was difficult for anyone to believe that these women, with their wealth, charm, and medical knowledge, could possibly be involved in anything sinister. Even the families who sent their loved ones to the convent were quick to dismiss any notion of wrongdoing. After all, the women who returned appeared to have been cured. But Dr. Hartwell could not shake the growing feeling that something was deeply wrong. One night, Thomas Brewster, a local trapper who had often hunted near the convent, stumbled upon the truth. He had been tracking a wounded deer through the dense woods when a strange, almost otherworldly sound drew his attention. It was a scream, a shriek so agonizing, so full of pain, that it froze him in his tracks. Thomas knew these woods well, and he had heard all manner of animal cries, but this was no animal. This was human. The scream seemed to echo through the cold, snow-laden forest, a sound so filled with suffering that it made Thomas's blood run cold. Intrigued and disturbed, Thomas followed the sound until he came upon the convent. As he neared the building, he noticed that the stone structure appeared to be dark and still, but the screams continued to echo in the night air. He crept around to the rear of the building, where he saw a faint light flickering from a basement window. It was then that he saw the shadowy figures moving inside. Figures that didn't seem to be behaving like ordinary people. Peering through the frosted glass, Thomas was horrified by what he saw. The basement had been transformed into a medical facility, a surgical theater that bore no resemblance to any religious retreat. A woman was strapped to a table, her eyes wide with terror as two figures hovered over her. Sister Prudence was standing over the woman, holding a metal instrument in her gloved hands. Thomas could see the gleam of exposed bone and dark tissue, evidence of the grisly procedure taking place. The woman's skull had been opened, and her mind was being altered with methodical precision. The other sister, Temperance, stood nearby, passing instruments to Prudence with an eerie calmness. The screams that had pierced the night were coming from this woman. Her agony was palpable, but what struck Thomas most was the casual way in which the Ashford sisters carried out the procedure. There was no hesitation, no sign of remorse. They were completely detached from the suffering they were inflicting. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Thomas fled into the woods. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled through the snow, desperate to escape the nightmare he had witnessed. When he finally returned to Millbridge, his mind was racing. He rushed to his father's blacksmith shop, babbling incoherently about what he had seen: the surgical instruments, the screams, the lifeless bodies strapped to tables. At first, Thomas's father, Elder Brewster, thought his son had suffered a breakdown from the cold or exhaustion. After all, it was difficult for anyone to believe such a fantastical tale. But when Thomas described the layout of the basement in precise detail, and spoke of the strange sounds and the instruments, his father realized that something was terribly wrong. He decided to seek the advice of Deacon Morrison, the most respected man in Millbridge, to investigate the matter discreetly. Deacon Morrison listened carefully to Thomas's account, but like everyone else, he found it hard to believe. The Ashford sisters had been nothing but respectful and charitable in the town. They had given generously to the church, and their reputation was impeccable. To accuse them of such a horrendous crime seemed unfathomable. But Deacon Morrison was also a man of principle, and he couldn't ignore the possibility that something truly sinister was happening behind the convent's closed doors. The deacon's investigation began subtly. He visited the convent, posing as a man seeking to discuss an upcoming church fundraiser that would require the sisters' involvement. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford greeted him with her usual serene smile and calm demeanor. She was everything he expected, a cultured, well-spoken woman of grace and refinement. She invited him inside for tea, and they spoke at length about the church's needs, all while Deacon Morrison watched the sisters and the women who lived under their care. While he spoke with Agatha, Morrison noticed something unsettling. The women he saw inside were eerily quiet, almost mechanical in their movements. When he attempted to make eye contact, they seemed to look right through him, as if they weren't really there. There was something unnatural about the way they behaved, something that didn't sit right with Morrison. But when he tried to ask about the basement, Agatha quickly diverted the conversation, claiming that the lower levels were reserved for the most intensive forms of spiritual counseling, which were inappropriate for a man to witness. She spoke with such conviction that Morrison, though troubled, couldn't press further. Despite the polite reassurances, Deacon Morrison's suspicions only deepened. As he left the convent, a sense of dread settled over him. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange details. What was really happening inside those stone walls? And why was the town so eager to ignore the growing whispers of discomfort? The first cracks in the Ashford sisters' facade began to show when Sarah Whitman, a young woman from a respected family in Boston, was sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears. Sarah had been a spirited woman, intelligent, independent, and fiercely determined to live life on her own terms. However, her family, especially her wealthy and powerful parents, could not tolerate her defiance of their expectations. Her refusal to reveal the identity of the man who had fathered her child out of wedlock threatened to bring shame upon their name, and in an effort to restore the family's reputation, they arranged for Sarah's commitment to the convent. Unlike many of the other women who had come to the convent broken and desperate for help, Sarah arrived with a strong will. She was determined not to let her family's pressure define her life. From the moment she entered the convent, she was aware of the strange energy surrounding the place, the quiet hum of something sinister beneath its outwardly peaceful facade. The sisters' serene manner, their constant calm, the way they controlled every aspect of the convent. There was something off about it. But it wasn't until Sarah was confined to the convent's interior that she began to realize just how deeply wrong things were. The Ashford sisters had established a routine, one that was enforced with an almost militaristic precision. Every woman in the convent, including Sarah, was required to follow the strictest regimen of prayer, meditation, and physical work. The days were long and monotonous, with little to distract the women from their inner turmoil. The sisters, particularly Mother Superior Agatha, would appear at random, overseeing the activities with a cold, clinical eye. Though the convent was cloaked in the semblance of spiritual discipline, there was something much darker happening behind its walls. Sarah's first weeks in the convent were spent in solitary confinement, a form of spiritual purification meant to break her of her will and force her to submit to the sisters' control. The isolation was harsh. Cold, barren rooms with no contact to the outside world, no distractions or comforts. At first, Sarah resisted, holding on to the belief that she could survive this ordeal without losing herself. But over time, she began to crack. The silence was unbearable, the loneliness suffocating. And then the whispers began. It started with a soft, almost imperceptible sound at night, a whispering voice so faint it was barely audible. But as the days passed, the voices grew louder, and soon Sarah could hear them clearly. The women in the convent were speaking in hushed tones, muttering in the middle of the night. It was as though they were talking to each other, yet no one dared to speak in the daylight hours. These whispered conversations, laden with fear and despair, made it clear to Sarah that something was deeply wrong with the convent. She overheard fragments of conversation about surgical procedures, about transforming the women's minds, and about the sisters' experiments to eliminate undesirable traits in their patients. One night, after several weeks of isolation, Sarah was summoned by Sister Prudence. The cold, calculating woman greeted Sarah in the usual manner, offering her no comfort, only a stern demand to comply. Sarah was taken to the basement. Though she had heard rumors about the basement, She had never before been allowed to see it. The sisters, of course, had kept it off limits to the women under their care, warning them that it was a place for the most sacred of rituals, not to be seen by ordinary eyes. But tonight, Sarah was to bear witness to something far worse than anything she could have imagined. As she was led down into the depths of the convent, the air grew colder, thicker, as though the very walls were breathing with an ancient, malevolent energy. The basement was dimly lit, with flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. It was a sterile environment, far more like a medical facility than a spiritual one. The room was lined with tables, operating tables, Sarah quickly realized, and medical instruments hung neatly on the walls. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something far more unsettling, something metallic, almost sickly. It was then that Sarah saw the first woman, strapped to the table, her eyes wide with terror. The woman's skull had been opened, exposing the fragile, vulnerable tissue beneath. Sister Prudence stood at the head of the table, manipulating a long, thin instrument with terrifying precision. The woman's body twitched involuntarily, her screams muffled by the sterile environment. Sister Prudence worked without emotion, as though this were nothing more than a routine procedure. She glanced briefly at Sarah, her eyes devoid of warmth, and continued with the task at hand. Sarah's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in place. The sight was so horrifying that it seemed to exist outside of reality, like a nightmare that couldn't be escaped. Mother Superior Agatha, who had entered the room shortly after, noticed Sarah's shock but said nothing. She only observed the procedure with the same cold detachment that had become their signature. "You see," Agatha's voice was soft, almost too gentle for the scene before her. "We are not simply healing these women, we are saving them. We are reshaping their very souls, their minds, their very beings so they can serve the greater good. These women come to us broken, diseased with the corruption of modern society. They are ill in ways that the world cannot comprehend. But we," she paused, her eyes locking onto Sarah's with unnerving intensity, "we know what needs to be done." As Sarah stood there, unable to move, the terrible truth began to settle into her bones. The Ashford sisters were not merely conducting medical treatments. They were experimenting. They were altering the very nature of the women who came to them, taking their memories, erasing their identities, and remaking them into something entirely different. These were not cures. These were grotesque modifications. They were turning women into puppets, obedient, compliant, and, most horrifying of all, unaware of the changes being made to their very selves. For the first time since her arrival, Sarah understood the true nature of the Ashford sisters' work. Their quest for knowledge was far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. They weren't seeking to heal, they were seeking control. They had made themselves gods, rewriting the very fabric of who their patients were. And they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve their goal. As Sarah stood in that cold, sterile room, the voices of the other women echoing in her mind, she knew that the only way to escape the nightmare was to expose it. She had to leave. She had to find a way to escape and bring the truth to light. But escaping would not be easy. The sisters were watching, and they had no intention of letting her, or anyone, leave. Sarah's resolve hardened. She would not allow herself to be another victim of their twisted experiment. She would fight back, even if it cost her everything. It was the only way to stop the Ashford sisters before they could destroy more lives. The truth had finally broken through the veil of silence that the Ashford sisters had so carefully constructed. Sarah Whitman knew now that the only way to save herself, and to save the other women trapped within the walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears, was to escape. She had to find a way to expose the horror that the Ashford sisters were conducting, no matter the cost. The discovery of their cruel experiments, the manipulation of minds, and the alteration of memories had shaken her to the core. But now she faced an even greater challenge. How could she escape a place that had been designed to keep its secrets hidden from the world? The convent, with its stone walls and guarded entrances, was nothing short of a fortress. The women inside, though broken, were not permitted to leave without the express permission of Mother Superior Agatha, and even then, there was a carefully orchestrated process that ensured the women could never fully reclaim their identities. Sarah's every attempt to connect with anyone beyond the convent had been thwarted. The villagers, too, had been fooled into thinking that the convent was a safe haven, a place of healing. No one suspected the true nature of the Ashford sisters' work. No one, except for a few brave souls like Dr. Samuel Hartwell and Thomas Brewster, who had tried to warn the community, only to be dismissed as mad. But Sarah wasn't mad. She was terrified, yes, but she was also resolute. Her mind raced as she lay in her darkened cell that night, listening to the muffled cries and whispered conversations of the other women. She knew that if she didn't act soon, she would lose her chance. The weight of the knowledge she carried pressed down on her, but she had one advantage that the Ashford sisters had underestimated: her will. The next day, Sarah was summoned by Sister Prudence, the coldest of the three Ashford sisters. She had always been the one to oversee the harsher treatments in the basement. Now, it seemed, Sarah was to become part of the next experiment. There was no doubt in Sarah's mind that she was being groomed for something far worse than what she had already witnessed. The question was not what the sisters would do to her, but how long she had before they could completely break her spirit. When Sarah entered the room where Sister Prudence awaited, her eyes locked on the tall woman with a fierce determination. Sister Prudence, standing near the operating table, her pale blue eyes devoid of warmth, gestured for Sarah to approach. "Sarah," she said softly, "it is time for you to understand the true purpose of your stay here. The reformation we offer is not just a cure. It is a gift that will save you from yourself, from the confusion of your mind, from the distractions of the outside world." Sarah stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face a mask of calm. She had come to understand that confrontation, even with the Ashford sisters, required nerve, and she was determined not to let fear paralyze her. "I don't need your gift," she said, her voice unwavering. "What you're doing here is not saving anyone. You're stealing their lives. You're erasing them." The words, though spoken with defiance, echoed through the room, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of something like doubt cross Sister Prudence's face. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by her usual implacable calm. "You misunderstand, my dear," Sister Prudence replied with a chilling calm. "You think you are whole, but you are not. You are broken. We are merely helping you find the peace you have longed for." Sarah felt a shiver of disgust pass through her, but she didn't flinch. She had to make her move. The sisters' arrogance and belief in their own righteousness made them blind to the fact that Sarah had already begun to plan her escape. The opportunity came that night, when the sisters gathered to discuss their progress in the convent's operations. Sarah knew that this was her moment. She had overheard enough to know that their meetings, held in the back of the convent's highest tower, were poorly guarded. It was the one place where she could slip away without anyone noticing her absence until it was too late. After the evening ritual had concluded and the other women had been locked in their cells for the night, Sarah quietly slipped into the shadows. She crept through the darkened halls, careful not to make a sound. Her heart raced in her chest, but she steeled herself, knowing that her only chance of survival and of exposing the truth was to escape. As she approached the door that led to the tower, she found the latch had not been securely locked. She pulled it open gently, taking a deep breath before stepping into the narrow stairwell. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, and every step she took echoed loudly in the silence. The door at the top of the stairs was locked, but Sarah had observed the keyholder during her time in the convent. Sister Temperance had a set of keys that she carried everywhere, but she often set them down on a nearby table when she attended the nightly prayer service. It had taken Sarah days to figure out the timing, but she had finally managed to steal the keys without anyone noticing. As she reached the top of the stairs, Sarah inserted the key into the lock, praying it would turn. There was a soft click as the door gave way, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding. The room was small, filled with dusty furniture and the smell of old parchment. This was where the sisters kept their most confidential documents, the records of their patients, their notes on the experiments, and the final results of their horrifying surgeries. Sarah's hands trembled as she sifted through the papers, looking for anything that could expose the sisters' twisted experiments. She found what she was looking for in a thick leather-bound journal. As she flipped through the pages, her blood ran cold. The sisters had been documenting every procedure, every mental and physical alteration they had inflicted on their patients. The notes were detailed and disturbingly clinical, and Sarah could see that these women were not merely reformed. They were completely transformed, wiped clean, their personalities surgically removed, their memories replaced by those the Ashford sisters desired. Just as Sarah was about to take the journal and make her escape, she heard footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly shoved the journal into her bag, barely managing to close it before the door creaked open. Sister Temperance appeared in the doorway, her dark eyes locking onto Sarah's with a look of both recognition and calculation. "Running away?" Temperance asked, her voice chillingly calm. Sarah froze. There was no time to think. She bolted for the window, throwing it open, and with a prayer, she climbed out, scrambling down the side of the convent. The cold night air slapped against her skin as she descended. Her hands were raw from gripping the stone, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She landed hard on the ground and ran. Ran as fast as she could through the woods, her breath ragged, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, the convent stood silent and dark, the nightmare she had just escaped looming in the distance. By the time Sarah Whitman reached the outskirts of Millbridge, her legs were numb, and her lungs ached for air. She had run for miles, not daring to stop, not daring to look back. The weight of what she had witnessed in the convent clung to her like a dark shadow. The Ashford sisters' cruelty had shattered her, but she had survived. She had escaped, and now it was her duty to expose the truth. She made her way to the nearest town, shaking with exhaustion but driven by the need to warn others. When she arrived at the nearest farmhouse, she was taken in by a kind couple who, seeing her disheveled state, offered her warmth and food. Sarah could barely speak at first, her voice choked with emotion. It wasn't until the couple pressed her that she told them about the horrors at the convent, the experiments, the mind manipulation, the women who had been broken and remade into something unrecognizable. The couple, horrified, urged Sarah to go to the local authorities. But Sarah was hesitant. The Ashford sisters had established such a firm grip on the community. Their influence ran deep. Even if she spoke out, who would believe her? The Ashford sisters had fooled everyone, including the most respected figures in Millbridge. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the town's physician, had praised their methods. Even Deacon Morrison had been swayed by their calm demeanor and the seeming success of their treatments. But Sarah knew that staying silent would be just as dangerous. She couldn't let the Ashford sisters continue their twisted work. The world needed to know what had happened behind the convent's stone walls. With the farmhouse couple's help, Sarah made the decision to go straight to the county sheriff. Sheriff Elias Turner was a man of few words, but his reputation for fairness and justice was well known. When Sarah finally told him everything, his face went pale. He listened intently, asking no questions until she had finished speaking. The sheriff's silence was unnerving, but Sarah could see that he was deeply troubled by what she had shared. He didn't doubt her, but there was a sense of disbelief in his eyes, as if he couldn't imagine the full extent of the evil that had been perpetrated in his own town. "I'll send some men to the convent to investigate," Sheriff Turner said, his voice low. "But I need you to stay hidden, Sarah. If the Ashford sisters find out you're the one who exposed them." He stopped, not needing to finish the thought. Sarah nodded in understanding. She had seen the lengths the sisters were willing to go to in order to protect their secrets. They would not stop until she was silenced. It was all too clear now. The Ashford sisters had grown accustomed to their power, and they would not let anyone take it from them without a fight. The sheriff's men, along with a few trusted townsfolk, made their way to the convent the following morning. As they approached the building, they were met with an eerie silence. No women were seen coming or going, and the building, though imposing, seemed strangely empty. The men knocked on the front door, but there was no response. It was only when they forced their way inside that they realized the magnitude of what had happened. The convent was in disarray. The women who had once filled the halls were nowhere to be found. Some of the rooms were locked, others abandoned. The basement, however, told a different story. It was there that the sheriff's men discovered the true horror. The operating tables were still there, along with the medical instruments. Papers detailing the surgeries and the procedures the Ashford sisters had conducted were scattered across the floor. The gruesome evidence was undeniable. But even with all the proof before them, the sheriff's men found no trace of the Ashford sisters. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Their rooms were empty, their personal belongings gone. The only thing left behind were the memories of the women they had manipulated, the evidence of their twisted experiments, and the fear that would linger long after their disappearance. The authorities issued a warrant for the Ashford sisters' arrest, but no one knew where to look. The sisters had covered their tracks too well. They had left Millbridge without a trace, taking all their secrets with them. The sheriff's office sent word to neighboring counties, but the search proved futile. The Ashford sisters had simply disappeared. Though Sarah's testimony was crucial in starting the investigation, the fact that the Ashford sisters were gone left a sense of unease that wouldn't soon fade. The town of Millbridge was left to grapple with the aftermath of their twisted actions. The women who had once lived under the sisters' rule were left to rebuild their lives, but the scars of their experiences would never fully heal. The mental and emotional toll of what had been done to them could not be erased, no matter how hard they tried to forget. Sarah, though relieved to have escaped, couldn't shake the feeling that the Ashford sisters were still out there, somewhere. They had planned everything so carefully, manipulated so many people, and left no stone unturned in their quest for control. It was as if they had known all along that their time in Millbridge would come to an end, but that didn't mean they would stop their experiments. They were far too dangerous, far too calculated to simply disappear. As Sarah looked back on the experience, she knew that the Ashford family's dark legacy would never truly be forgotten. The women who had been subjected to the sisters' cruel methods carried the scars of their treatment, and while the town had been freed from the sisters' grip, the fear and the memories remained. The Ashford sisters had left their mark on Millbridge, and their story would haunt the town for generations to come. The Ashford sisters disappeared as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind a town scarred by their presence. Millbridge, once a peaceful community, would never be the same. The dark truth of the Convent of Eternal Tears had been unveiled, but the mystery of the Ashford family's fate remained. Where had they gone? Why had they left so abruptly? And most chilling of all, had they truly disappeared? Or was this only the beginning of something even darker? For Sarah Whitman, the aftermath was a tangled web of emotions. She had escaped the clutches of the Ashford sisters, but the horrors she had witnessed would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had tried to forget the faces of the women she had seen in the basement, the tortured expressions of those whose minds had been erased, but the images stayed with her, lingering in the quiet moments when she was alone. The women who had been under the sisters' control tried to rebuild their lives, but many were left with empty spaces in their memories, moments lost to time, their personalities warped beyond recognition. The town of Millbridge, too, struggled with its guilt and its denial. How could they have allowed such atrocities to happen right under their noses? They had been blinded by the sisters' charm and their promises of salvation, too willing to overlook the whispers and rumors that began to surface. The sheriff's office continued to search for any trace of the Ashford sisters, but it was as if they had evaporated into thin air. Not a single clue surfaced to suggest where they had gone or what they intended to do next. The investigation was soon closed, and the case was relegated to the cold files of the sheriff's office. Some said the sisters had left the country. Others whispered that they had taken refuge in one of the more remote corners of America. But in the end, no one knew for sure. Despite the silence that followed their disappearance, there was one thing that no one in Millbridge could deny. The Ashford sisters had left a legacy of fear and uncertainty. They had made their mark on the town, their manipulations and cruelties forever etched in the memories of those who had crossed their path. Sarah, though physically free, felt the weight of her experiences for the rest of her life. She moved away from Millbridge, but the memories of the convent, of the women she had met, and of the sisters who had altered so many lives, never left her. She became an advocate for women's rights, dedicating her life to helping those who had suffered in silence, just as she once had. In the end, the story of the Ashford family remained a mystery, one that would be passed down through the generations as a cautionary tale. A tale of how easily evil can disguise itself as good, and how the quietest places can sometimes harbor the most sinister of secrets.